Welcome to the number one podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
Just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're gonna lose. Coming down the stretch, you're gonna lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod, here to begin our trip around the Big Ten. This year we have 17 teams to preview along with our deep dive at the Spartans. Each year Rod will offer his prognostication for the final standings of the Big Ten, 1 through 18. This also means that you, dear listener, can enter our Beat Rod challenge to see if you are better predicting than Rod. The winner gets $100 in free apparel from our great Spartan sponsor, Nudge Printing. Do you remember how you did last year, Rod?
Not well, and this year's going to be even tougher. Because one, because we got 18 teams. Two, because as is going to be apparent as we go through these previews, in the modern era of constantly shifting rosters, and we're going to talk about an example of that today, trying to discern quality differences before the teams actually start playing is, I think, a very difficult task. So I'm saying all that to say that I'm giving myself a huge out on the accuracy or lack thereof.
And also, in your defense, is that you're making these predictions before watching them play.
Well, that's what I mean.
You know, I bet. But everybody else will at least have had an opportunity to watch before Big Ten play starts, since that makes a huge difference.
The thing is,
obviously.
And that's not to say that these things didn't happen before, but even in within the season itself. So, for example, a team like Ohio State comes in preseason. I bought in. I had them ranked very high. I wasn't unusual, and they really struggled out of the gate. They were 4-10 at one point in the league, and that's what cost Chris Holtmann his job. And then all of a sudden they elevate an interim and they go on a 5-1 streak to end the season. Same team. And they beat good. And the thing is, it's not like, they beat Purdue in that stretch. They wasn't that they were beating up on poor opposition either. So, what clicked? And it's not to say that stuff didn't happen in the past. Of course it did. But anecdotally, at least, my impression is that trying to get a firm grip on where most teams are going to be, even within the season, is proving to be increasingly difficult. And I think it's mostly for the reasons that we've talked about a lot on occasion here, which is the portal especially having the impact that it does on continuity or lack thereof, that you no longer are in situations where you can say, and a classic example, this is going to be the team we talk about today. You no longer, as a coach, can say, all right, I'm going to take my lumps with a young team, but by the time these guys are juniors, we're going to have something. That used to be the path. And it was always the way that you approached it, that, okay, I need to recruit my guys, get them in the system, work with them, develop that talent for a couple of years, and then we'll be in a position to challenge. And then hopefully the next challenge is that you get off that cycle of boom bust. You just continue to have guys coming in behind them, basically what Tom Izzo has done at Michigan State. Yeah. But that's become a model that is increasingly rare. Is we truly are. It's not just a glib line. It's the truth. It's a year-to-year sport now. And and you can't look at it that way. So that's, the way that we used to. Well, I have to build a program. It's the best you can do, I guess, is to say, well, as a coach, I want to build a culture, which means that my style of play and my expectations aren't going to change, but the players sure are, because of the portal. They're just not around for multiple years the way they used to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's even far more fluctuation than you get in, because, with free agency, there's always, there's a lot of turnover in professional sports, but even,
it's
not
extreme.
nothing like what it is in college basketball. It's the extreme of that.
College, you think about it this way, big time college sports has gone from the most restrictive system in big time sports in America, which it was, because the only way you could leave where you were was to transfer, and that meant that you had to sit out a year. So that was always the most restrictive system. It's gone from that to the least restrictive system. It's free agency on demand every single year. And so that, to think that that's not going to have profound implications on the sport is, I think, is misguided. And I think most people, to be honest, I don't think there are many people wondering why or this is happening. I think most people intuitively grasp that this is the reason. And how you feel about that is a question that I suppose has many legitimate answers, right? You can like the fact that every season truly is a new beginning, and that you have opportunities as a program to get off the mat quickly. Certainly for new coaches, it's, we're going to talk about a few of them. I think there are 4 in the Big Ten this year. 2 of the new schools, the West Coast schools, have new coaches, and then Michigan and Ohio State also brought in new coaches. So it potentially shortens the path for those guys. But then I think on the other hand, and we've had this discussion with a handful of the guests we've had this summer, and we even had it last off season too. And you get different answers from different people as to how much people think this is affecting the quality of the sport. I do intuitively feel as if it has to. I just can't see a scenario where having entirely new rosters every year in the vast majority of programs, even high major programs, is a good thing for quality of the sport. That just seems counterintuitive to me. You could legitimately debate how much of a hit it is to that, but I can't see a scenario where one could say, hey, it's better basketball produced by guys who are just getting to know each other, as opposed to guys who have played 2 years, 3 years together. That just doesn't make any sense intuitively to me.
I mean, that goes with the team in any sort of aspect of life.
Yeah.
When you have opportunity, when you work together, we're better working together. And it doesn't even matter sports. I mean, just right. I mean,
it's what, for example, to go off sports, one thing that I came to know about early in my working life was, there's this concept, and you're starting to see it raised again in the last few days around the Supreme Court. There's this concept of term limits, right? Started to become very popular in the 1990s with regard to politics. And in fact, we imposed them in Michigan on legislatures. Well, that sounds great to a lot of people. It's, we're getting back to citizen legislators. We don't have these professional politicians anymore. Well, okay, I understand the arguments, but what gets lost in that is there's this thing called institutional memory.
Yep.
And when you are constantly turning people over, you no longer have people who have been around long enough to know how to do things. So you're constantly in a state where whoever is responsible for quote unquote doing things is having to reinvent the wheel. That has a cost. Now, again, you can argue it's a cost worth bearing. I'm not weighing in on that, but you can't ignore that there's a downside to it. There is, and it's the same thing with this. When you don't have guys who stick around 4 or 5 years in a program, it's year to year to year. I mean, we've got guys. I was just doing another preview, writing one up for a program we're not going to talk about for quite a while in this. The other night, we've got guys now starting at one program, moving on somewhere else, and then coming back to the original program. That's already that's happened in a couple of instances already in the Big Ten since the portal. Yep. There was the Wahab kid, the big man, who ended up at Penn State, but prior to that, he had done 2 stints at Maryland, sandwiched around
Georgetown?
Yeah.
Georgetown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just, it's crazy. So, I don't know. Well, you can debate it, but the upside of why I'm talking about all of this is when you go through a process like the one we're about to embark on here, and you're trying to sort out, well, who's the 18th best team in the league and who's the 11th best team. There's a difference between the team we're going to talk about today and Purdue. That's pretty clear.
Right.
But anything much in the middle of that, good luck. I mean, what you're really having to do is you're having to look at half a roster of new guys. And by the way, that's even true of Michigan State this year. I mean, Michigan State, between freshmen and transfers, 5 new guys. That's a lot for the MSU program. So even to an extent, the most stable program in the league is dealing with this. But it's true of everybody. When you're really trying to sort out which of these entirely new combination of players do I think is going to gel the best, you can't. I mean, to think that you're going to be dialed in enough to get that exactly right is crazy. I'll tell you what I default to, more or less, when I'm doing these things and making these picks, so people understand the mindset. I'm really defaulting more and more to coaches. It's just, and that's even a fool's errand, because as we know, there can be a difference. And it's not like there are guys who I think have proven to just be rocks out every year. Doesn't matter what roster they have, they're going to get it done. But you do have more faith or less faith in certain guys. And so that's really, as much as anything, that's where I'm finding myself defaulting to as well. I believe in Matt Painter a little more than I do Kevin Willard. Things like that.
Yeah.
And that's it. And then when the season starts, good luck, because
well, this all just reminds me of an old joke about the news crew at a local television station, where everyone's basically giving the weatherman a hard time about always being wrong. And he said, give me a break. These guys tell you what happened, but I have to predict the future. And
right.
I think that is a little bit of what's going on here. But, it still lends the opportunity for a contest, and we will have this. Rod's going to try not to be in the basement this year. He's going to try, he'll be much better, I'm sure, this season, because, there's certainly a tremendous amount of luck that goes into this. But send along your entries to me at Eric, ERIC, at TFFINOTS.com. So your rankings 1 to 18 and how the standings for the Big Ten. And we'll use the standings used by the Big Ten as far as tiebreakers for, ties and all that kind of stuff for the Big Ten tournament. And also the tiebreaker for the contest will be how many points Michigan State scores against Michigan this year. And they do play twice. All right, so we're going to begin our trek through the league in Rod's reverse order, and we'll skip Michigan State to the end. So we're going to go from the bottom up. Today is number 18. It's probably a surprise to not many people, the Minnesota Golden Gophers. So last season, Ben Johnson had some momentum again. He actually got things going after a second season where they were truly dreadful. They were 9-22, one of the worst Big Ten teams really in quite some time. With I think their Ken Palm was at sub 200.
It was. Yeah.
So last year they had a new backcourt, great good 1-2 punch. Dawson Garcia was healthy and played well, and Pharrell Payne. They were 19-15 overall and 9-11 in the Big Ten, which was their best finish in quite some time. They were from the sub 200s in Ken Palm to number 78, which is pretty good. They were much, much better on the offensive end, where they were 58th in offense efficiency. Had good shooting for both the 2s and 3s, which are driven a little bit by the players we'll talk about later. The defense was okay. They were at 115th, but that was better than the previous year where they were 188th. So there's every reason to think that they were not only they improved this year with flirting with getting close to the tournament. I mean, they were not obviously on the bubble, but they were within, they could see it. they had it. You could imagine a couple of breaks and maybe they could make it on this year. But, as we just talked about, the portal hit Minnesota hard this year. And again, this is going to be a test again to Johnson. And I think to one respect, it's going to be we always judge head coaches based on a number of factors. One, how do they recruit? What kind of players they bring in? How do they coach, obviously, and how their success. Postseason more important than even the regular season. And then third, it's going to be a new one. I think it's going to be a very important one. How well do you re-recruit your players and how can you hang on to them? And so I think that's going to be probably as important in certain places. And so that we're going to find out about Ben Johnson. You can recruit all the great players. You can coach really well. But if you can't hang on to players who are good into the next season, your ability to grow and to have a cohesive program is going to really be challenged. And so that looks like where they are now. And so this may just be a mindset change for these coaches. And maybe you're just in a situation like at a place like Minnesota without the NIL support that other programs have, that maybe you just can't be successful. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think those are things, to be determined in the future. So anyway, I guess your thoughts on Minnesota.
Yeah, that's a pretty good recapitulation of where they're at, and it's, I feel for them, and because it does, at a certain point, it does. If I was a Minnesota fan, it would start to feel as if you're in this catch-22 where, okay, you don't have enough talent to succeed, but then you start accumulating talent and it starts producing some results, not mind-blowing, but enough that you could start to see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? Which I think would be a good way of describing the season they had last year. But then the problem is that talent opts to go to what are perceived by those players to be greener pastures, and you're right back to square one. So the question starts to become, are we in a position where we can ever truly build something? Are we going to be able to retain enough talent year to year to actually get up the ladder in the league and find ourselves in, the upper tier, at least on occasion? And it's tough because I like Ben. I like what I've seen from Ben Johnson. He's had 3 seasons, and 2 of them, they've exceeded expectations. Now, the one in the middle was awful. No two ways about that. But his first season, he had a team mostly made up of guys who had transferred in from mid-major programs. He had as little depth as I think I've ever seen from a Big Ten program, and yet still managed to make them competitive on a nightly basis. Then last year, they were more than competitive. I mean, as we go through these previews, it is amazing how many Big Ten programs were in the 9-11 to 11-9 band. Almost everybody. So it's not like they're 9-11. Wow, they really had a great, but they were a competitive team. There's no two ways about it. Night to night, Minnesota could get just about anybody. And boy, it looked like they were going to be loaded for bear, as they say, this season with most all of those guys back. Well, it didn't end up working out that way. And I think that caught everybody by surprise, caught me by surprise, because I didn't think they would have the mass defections that they did. It could have been worse. I mean, they actually do retain, Dawson Garcia, Mike Mitchell, those 2 guys are back. So those 2 starters return. Believe me, Dawson Garcia has already played for about 18 schools. So it wouldn't have been shocking, though, to see a guy like him go back into the portal. But I think the deal with him is he's already done the blue blood thing, because he played a year at North Carolina. He also played at Marquette. So maybe for him, it's like, being home being in a place where I know I'm the man, that's what I want. Maybe that was it. But with a lot of these other guys, it's just apparently too tempting. And you might be right. It might be as simple as NIL opportunities. Your mind always goes there first these days.
Yeah.
And I don't know a lot about the particulars with Minnesota. I would assume and I would guess that their NIL for basketball is not incredibly strong. And that might be something, that's going to be something that when coaches are making decisions as to what jobs to take, that's going to become right at the top of the list. Already has been. What kind of shape is your NIL program in? Because if you don't have that, you can find yourself in exactly the position we're talking about that Ben Johnson occupies, which is, okay, I get some guys in, we put together a decent season, and we got a chance to be better than decent if I can keep them. But can I keep them?
Yeah.
And so you have to feel some level of empathy, I guess, for anybody in that position, any coach in that position. And Ben Johnson has always struck me as a good guy. He's somebody that I think, as a neutral fan, you would want to see succeed. He's not running his mouth saying stupid things. His program seems to be about the right things. He's a native of Minnesota, so it means something to him just to have this work. But boy, it's tough. On the other end, I would say this. We're picking this team 18th, so that's dead last in a gigantic league. But they have legitimate proven players. That, Garcia is a guy who, in the right scenario, could be a first-team All-Big Ten player. He has that level of talent. And he's got some production behind him now, too. That's not usual for a team you're picking last. So that also says something, and I guess that's an element of the modern situation that we also have to appreciate, maybe as a positive, that, yeah, it's hard to sustain success. But the other end of it is you don't tend to see teams that are just mired in absolute awfulness the way that you may be used to. Because anybody has a chance to get at least a player or two who is legit. And Minnesota has a couple of those guys. So that means that even though we're picking them 18th, I'm not saying Minnesota won't be dangerous on a night-to-night basis. They might be.
Yeah, and I think, the other nature of the things is basketball, there are only 5 players in the court. So you could hit the lottery and get 2 players.
Yep.
And suddenly you've got a legitimate, threat to,
that's right,
maybe not win the league, but certainly make the tournament suddenly that, just people just didn't see. So
that's kind of my point. And even if you don't take it to that extreme, just that, okay, you're playing in Minneapolis on a Wednesday night and, they're 2-9 in the league, but you can't. They have Dawson Garcia. They've got Mike Mitchell.
Yeah, right,
They've got guys that on a given night could jump up and get you. In the past, that wasn't always the case with a team you picked to finish last in the league, Yep.
All right, we'll begin with the players departing. This is brought to you by the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. As they can come clean your house, clean your windows, some of these teams got cleaned out, and that's going to be the case here for Minnesota largely. So the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids, you get 15% off if you mention Final Four. When you get your estimate, you can find ways to get a hold of them at our support page at the Final Four, on theschedule.com/support. They can not only power wash your house, clean your windows, obviously, but the inside, the outside, the windowsills. They do fantastic work. They worked on our house, and I can see much clearer outside. So if you need someone in the Grand Rapids area or even the Grand Rapids adjacent area, so it's a pretty large region, head on over to the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. You won't regret it. All right, so we begin with Elijah Hawkins, 5'11" point guard. Gave him exactly what they needed. He was a creator. I don't think he played in the first matchup with Michigan State. I think, didn't he sit out that first game? Yeah. So he averaged 9.5 points a game on 39, 36, and 78 shooting. Led the Big Ten in assists at 7.5 a game to just 2.7 turnovers a game. But as with many of these players, he had decided to transfer. He's heading to Texas Tech, and he's obviously someone that you thought was going to be a great core for Minnesota going forward in the future.
huge loss. The single biggest difference between Minnesota of 2 years ago, where they were awful, and last year where they were competitive and solid, in my opinion, was Elijah Hawkins. There were other differences too, but it's always, I talk about this, and I'm going to return to this subject frequently, but especially when we talk about Michigan State. The point guard position in any level of the sport is the most important, in my opinion. It's not just my opinion. I think that's pretty much undeniable.
Mm-hmm.
But it is it can be a force multiplier, in that if you have the right guy at that position, which usually translates to somebody who makes their teammates better, that is not just about having a good player at one position. That's about making everybody around them better than they would otherwise be. And I would submit that's what happened in Minneapolis last year with Elijah Hawkins. You know, he was a transfer up guy from, I believe, from Howard. So he was like the lower levels of D1. But boy, did he translate. He shot decently, but that wasn't really his strength. His strength was playmaking. He led the Big Ten in assists. And I think a guy like that, it just makes such a difference. And it was obvious, the difference that he made for Minnesota last season. And with him going to Texas Tech, they're kind of back to square one in that department. It's unfortunate. But that's the state of play in 2024.
And the next player we'll talk about is, it surprised me a little bit more, just Cam Christie. First of all, he's a brother, a 6'6" brother of former MSU guard Max Christie, who went to the NBA after one season. Not highly regarded, but played really well last year. He was averaged 11.3 points a game as a freshman, shot 40, 39, and 79. He gave him some size. He was serviceable on defense, but certainly he gave him a lot of scoring that they just didn't have the year before, which is one of the big problems. They didn't have any shooting, and he brought that for sure. I don't know if this is a family thing or just, but he's decided to take off and go to the NBA. And so I guess we'll see how it goes for him. He's following his brother's footsteps.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The old equation used to be, and this wasn't a hard and fast rule, but it was more often than not. The Christies are a family that, if my understanding is, not hurting economically at all.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And valued education, both. I mean, if you remember Max at Michigan State, obviously a very bright kid. His brother, I think, the same way. You always used to assume guys like that would be more likely to hang around college for a while, maybe not 4 years. If their talent was such that it was undeniable that they needed to go, okay, well, that would happen. But in both situations, it wasn't just that they left after 1 year, it's that it caught almost everybody by surprise that they did so.
Yeah.
So you compare it to, like, if you remember at Michigan State, the most obvious example of this was Deontay Davis. He left after a very good freshman year, and I think people were surprised by that because although he had shown a lot of potential, it was also equally obvious that he needed to develop certain things. He wasn't a finished product. But his family situation, the economics of it, pretty much demanded that he make that choice. That's my understanding, at least. And so you can't quibble with those kind of moves. But the Christies, that both of them were seen as major surprises that they did it. But here's the thing. For Max, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it has worked. He just signed a new deal after 2 years in LA this offseason. And for a guy who hasn't had a huge breakthrough at the NBA level, I mean, he certainly played and has done well, better than some of his critics thought he would. But he hasn't. He's not a regular 20-minute a night guy yet or anything like that. But he's already on a second contract. It's clearly worked. For Cam, who knows? I mean, he made the move. He got drafted. That's the first positive, is that he was proven right from that perspective. The Clippers took him in the second round. We'll see how his career goes. But, it was even more surprising with him because Max was a McDonald's All-American. Max was recruited by Duke and, everybody else. So his level of talent was always understood. Cam was outside the top 100. He was not considered the same level of prospect. And, case in point, he ends up in Minnesota. That's no knock on Minnesota, but it's a reality. That's not where an elite prospect, especially who's not from the state of Minnesota, is likely to end up, but he did. And then he came out and was just great, as you said. Gave them perimeter shooting. They didn't have, he killed Michigan State when they faced him. Double-digit scoring, good size on the wing at 6'6". He was passable defensively, but it was the offense that really provided a boost. And then, Ben Johnson. So Ben Johnson hits on a guy who was clearly undervalued as a recruit, and he gets 1 year out.
Yeah, right.
It's a hard reality.
You also wonder on some level if they made the calculation that knowing this is an exceptionally weak NBA draft by all sort of
I think so.
accounts, they thought this is probably the best chance of getting out and getting drafted and then giving you an opportunity to, have a chance in the league. So who knows?
That's a good point.
Part of the calculations.
That's a good point. And again, you can't, thus far, the oft-criticized decisions of the Christie brothers have broken the right way. So I'm not about to suggest that it's doomed to failure for Cam, because clearly it's worked for Max, and Cam got drafted in that thought process you just mentioned might have been part of the equation. And if that's the case, well, it might end up being a pretty smart move.
Yeah.
To take advantage of a situation like that.
Moving on to Farrell Payne, 6'10" center. He averaged 10 points a game, 6.1 rebounds a game, along with almost 1.5 blocks. Shot 60% from the floor, paltry 47% from the line. Had a great freshman season. Looked pretty good. Is getting better, and then decided to leave Minnesota and head on down to Texas A&M to follow what's his name from Michigan State, who ended up down Texas A&M as well.
Julius Marble.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, another big loss. I mean, Payne was a guy who was really developing into a problem down low. He had a promising freshman season, showed a lot of potential, came back, and then I think really started to make good on that. When you're at 10-6 with a block and a half per game, that's, as a sophomore, that's indicating that there's probably even more in the tank. And I think he would have had a chance had he stayed at Minnesota over his last 2 years. I could have seen him developing him potentially into an all-Big Ten guy. He's got all the tools. He's a Minnesota native, and, that was something else that I wanted to mention with this. My criticism of Minnesota over the years has often centered around the fact that they couldn't seem to recruit their home state very well. That was a long-standing problem. It was a problem Richard Pitino had for sure. Other coaches that preceded him, Tubby Smith. Meanwhile, Wisconsin, who's been one of the best programs in the league over the last 25 years, has made a killing with Minnesota kids. So it had been a long-standing problem. But Ben Johnson actually has recruited a lot of Minnesota kids, Minnesota natives, and yet he's losing them.
Yeah.
And Payne's an example of that. It's really unfortunate. And again, without drilling down any deeper than I have to think that this move is about NIL. I have to think that Texas A&M said, well, we can pay you X, and Minnesota couldn't match it, and he left. Because on a basketball level, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
He didn't go to Duke. He didn't go to Kentucky. He went to a program, Texas A&M, you could argue they've had a little more success than Minnesota in recent years, but there's not a difference there.
No.
Then those are schools that are more or less peers, but perhaps not in some important ways that matter now, meaning NIL.
Yeah. Well, then going on to Joshua Ola Joseph, 6'7" forward, was really great. Sophomore year, kind of came down to earth a little bit. He averaged 7.5 points a game, 2.2 rebounds a game, shot 61, 41, and 74 on the season. He also decided to leave his home state of Minnesota and head out to the Atlantic Coast Conference to Cal.
The Atlantic Coast Conference with a school that is within spitting distance of the Pacific Ocean.
We need Hawaii to join the ACC. That'd be perfect.
Right? Yeah, we really do. Or maybe the University of Pacific. It's this one again. This might be a little bit of a different scenario. Ola Joseph got a lot of time early last year. If you remember when Michigan State played them the first time, I think he was shooting over 50% from three. He ended up coming back to earth a little bit, but he just got off to a great start. And then at some point, Johnson figured out that he could play Payne and Garcia together for long stretches.
Yeah.
And it worked. Minnesota started winning more. That reduced Ola Joseph's role. I don't know if that was the key to him leaving. But a transfer to Cal, there's no question that's a step. You could argue it's a slight step down, but it's a step down. I'm telling you that as somebody who saw some years of Cal basketball, even when they were good, the Jason Kidd era. It's not the same. You could argue Texas A&M might be a peer. I would not argue Cal is a peer. And I can't imagine that it was an NIL move, because I find it impossible to believe that Cal is unleashing an NIL gun for men's basketball. It just maybe water polo, maybe that, but not men's basketball.
Different ball, yeah.
So I just have to think it was maybe frustration around his role being reduced the second half of the season, or coaching relationship, something like that. I have to assume.
Yeah, and this may go
but
into
it's a loss, because he would have played a bigger role this year for sure.
Yeah, and it may just go into the whole re-recruiting players throughout the season, maintain that relationship. That
Absolutely.
may be something that just people need to focus on more. I don't know. It's hard to say. So the next two departing players we're going to talk about are, I think, more of the traditional departures we see.
Yeah.
So Braden Carrington, 6'4" wing, heading to Tulsa, so step down for the Big Ten. He just really couldn't score last year. He averaged 4.6 points a game on 34, 22, and 77 shooting, which was worse than what he was as a freshman.
Yeah, it was heading the wrong way. And again, in-state kid, they liked his competitiveness. He was a guy who played hard, had some defensive ability, I thought. But, just couldn't find his shot. And then when you see that he transfers to Tulsa, okay, that's telling.
Yeah.
Because he's not finding another high major to take him on. He's going down a level, so it tells you something.
And going down probably even further is Isaiah Innan, 6'9" forward, who's actually recruited under Richard Pitino. He's been just battling injuries and missed a couple seasons. Finally got back to play, but didn't really do a whole lot. He averaged 3.4 points a game and 1.9 rebounds a game on 44, 36, and 50, but only played 11 minutes a game. So he's going to head down to Liberty, where he'll have 2 seasons to play.
Yeah, tough situation when you, at this team last year, had 2 guys, we'll talk about the second one in a minute,
right?
Who missed 2 straight years due to injuries. That's incredible in a negative way. But you look at the raw numbers and they're not terrible, but he just clearly never seemed to get full trust of Johnson. And then again, you look at where he's going, transferring to Liberty, that's a couple levels down.
Yeah.
So again, it's telling.
So then moving on to returning players, brought to you by Nudge Printing. If you need Spartan apparel for football or basketball, any other sport, There's no better place than Nudge Printing. You can find it at nudgeprinting.com. 20% off if you type in Final Four, just one word, in the checkout. That's where our family gets all our Spartan stuff. They also have other options besides just apparel. They have big, giant fathead stickers. They've got ones for your computer. And they also have plenty of other schools in the state of Michigan. Just check it out. They've got a massive selection of all kinds of stuff. It's all high quality, really comfortable gear. So head on over to Nudge Printing. You won't regret it. So we'll begin with Dawson Garcia. We've talked about him a couple times before already. He's 6'10", and I think last year's the year he finally really showed what he's made of. He came to averaging 17.6 points a game, 6.7 rebounds a game, shot 49, 32, and 80. He was definitely dangerous from three last year. Although he didn't have like astronomical numbers of 32, he would have some games where he'd really get going. And he's, like you said too, he is from Minnesota, so it's natural that he would finish his final season there, where he's played for about everybody, Marquette, North Carolina.
Yeah, if you remember, we had former MSU assistant Mike Garland on.
Yep.
And we must have had him on talking about the Minnesota game. Because he talked about Dawson Garcia as a high school recruit. And he said there was what happened with Garcia, what made him a McDonald's All-American, is he had a stretch in EYBL his last year where he just could not miss from three. And then you combine that with his size and his ability to score in other ways, and it was like, okay, this guy's got the complete package offensively. He's an elite player. And then it didn't translate consistently when he hit college. But I think the second half of last season, it finally all came together. I remember it must have been the first time Michigan State played Minnesota. He came into the game shooting in the low 20s from three. And then, if I remember correctly, it was in one of the two games, he just killed Michigan State, hit a late three. The game in Minneapolis,
yeah,
for
Minneapolis
sure.
game, yeah.
And he just caught fire. And then by the end of the season, 32% is not world beating, but it's respectable. And he was not respectable for a good portion of last season. So he's got to maintain that. But if he does, you're talking about a guy who can be first team All Big Ten, as I say. And he might not, no matter what he does, if Minnesota struggles the way I think they will as a team. But talent-wise, he's there. He's at that level. He really does have the complete package. I wouldn't say he's a great low-post player, but he's effective enough that he can hurt you posting up. He is very good facing up because he has a good handle at his size. He can go past people. And then again, when the three is dialed in, well, that's a three-level scorer you're talking about. He's also a capable rebounder. I mean, he's just a very, very talented kid. No doubt about that.
And then moving on to Mike Mitchell, 6'3" transfer from Pepperdine, who came in as a shooter and largely shot well last season. He scored 10.2 points a game on 42, 40, and 80 when shooting. Without Hawkins, I mean, he's going to have to play point guard maybe. And so he averaged 2.6 assists per game to 1.8 turnovers a game, so not bad. But he averaged 5 assists per game in the previous season at Pepperdine where he played more points. So that's going to be his role going forward. But for Minnesota, it could have been worse. As you mentioned before, they at least got Mitchell back along with Garcia.
Yeah, very, very important because at least he's proven to be capable of handling the point guard spot. But the thing is, he's not Hawkins.
Yeah, right.
I don't think he'll play at that level. And the downside from a Minnesota perspective is you're now taking a guy who was pretty effective off the ball. Mitchell was a streaky shooter. You see 40% from three. That's a really good number. But he was not a guy. He reminds me of only in this sense, not across the board as a player. But if you remember, Gabe Brown was that way for Michigan State, where Gabe would go 1 for 7 one night, 5 for 8 the next. And you go, okay, well, that's a 40% shooter, right? Well, yeah, but you didn't know for sure what you were going to get night to night. Mitchell was a little bit like that. He struck me as being a little streaky, but still on balance over the course of the season, hey, you'll take it. Now you're putting him on the ball, and you never know for sure how guys will be able to balance those responsibilities, running an offense versus getting their own. And believe me, they need him to get his own. They need him to give them perimeter scoring. You know, you mentioned one of the big areas of improvement last year for Minnesota was perimeter shooting. Well, Mitchell was a big part of that, and they've lost some other parts. They lost Cam Christie. They lost Ola Joseph. They lost, even Hawkins was decent there. So they've got to get it from somewhere, and some of it has to come from Mitchell. How well is he going to be able to balance that with his playmaking responsibilities? That's an open question.
And then Parker Fox. So we mentioned Isaiah Innan, who survived 2 years of missing because of injuries. Parker Fox in the same boat. He came back, 6'8", 240-pound, former D2 player, and pretty amazing. He came back and actually was pretty productive for the limited time he'd see on the floor. He averaged 5.1 points a game, a little under 3 rebounds a game in 14 minutes, shot 68% from the floor, 48% from the line. But a guy who played super hard, played, I think, well within the system, and very old. He'll be 26 last year, partly a reflection of COVID and just all the injuries, redshirt. So a guy who's an important piece for them to come back for a depth perspective.
He's 8 years older than many freshmen. 7 or 8 years older than pretty much any freshman, right?
He's gotten his PhD by now.
And no offense, Parker Fox. I think it's a great story that he's come back and been able to play finally. Hats off to him for the perseverance and dedication that shows. I don't wish him ill at all, but come on, what are we doing in this sport? It's one thing if you're talking about pros, you see that kind of gap, fine. But it's not what we have come to know as college basketball. Anyway, pretty effective. I will say this, I would say the angriest I think I saw Tom Izzo last year in what was a frustrating season was it must have been the game in Minneapolis where I think it was twice Malik Hall, who was generally a very reliable defender, had Parker Fox blow by him twice. I still don't know how that happened. Parker Fox has 2 straight years missed due to leg injuries, lower body injuries, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, I think in his dead level best athletically, he wasn't a great athlete. That's my assumption. How that happened, I still don't know. But pretty decent productivity from him. And, look, he gives them some legitimate size at 6'8", 240. God knows he's experienced. And you look at this roster, he could even start. I think at a minimum, he's going to play more than he did last season, health permitting. So he's an important player for them to have.
And the final returning player is Caden Betts, 6'8", redshirt sophomore. Played only sparingly last year, but, may be able to get in and do a little bit more this year. Seen as an athletic hybrid forward.
Yeah, hard to know that there's much to expect here. He had 2 years in the program, and he hasn't really been able to break through. Given the roster turnover, it probably represents another opportunity for him. I mean, they see him as a guy who can play the 3 or the 4. If he gets his shot dialed in, may be able to give them some offensive versatility, but pretty much an unknown at this point. And I think you're safer assuming that he's probably not a big part of what they do, but, the opportunity is there given the roster turnover, as I said.
And then we'll go over the newcomers, of which there are plenty. Let's start with Luce Patterson, 6'2" transfer from Charlotte. Played 2 years previously at Missouri State. He's also from Minnesota, averaged 14.6 points a game on 44, 35, and 76 shooting last season.
Yeah, I think Patterson is a guy you have to pencil in as a likely starter. And he's capable of playing a little bit on the ball as well. They're going to need help from Mitchell there. So he averaged 2.5 assists per game last season at Charlotte. So I would anticipate he spends some time at point guard as well. But I think he's going to start off the ball. And as we talked about, this is a team whose competitiveness was in part keyed on their improved three-point shooting a year ago. Well, they lost a bunch of guys who were a big part of that. So they need to replace that production. And Patterson would be an example of somebody they would hope can give them that.
Then it's Femi Adukale, 6'6" wing, who has played at Pitt, Seton Hall, and just came back from New Mexico State. He averaged 10.7 points a game, 6.4 rebounds a game, shooting 43, 31, and 50. Not a high-volume three-point shooter. So he'll probably be the replacement for Cam Christie, which seems like it's probably going to be a bit of a downgrade.
Certainly in shooting, that would be a fair assumption. Very different kind of player, more of a power wing type, definitely does most of his damage inside the arc. But again, size and experience at a position where they're going to need some help. I think he too is a likely starter. He's at least going to get a chance. And if he doesn't start, he's going to play a lot. Definitely brings some grit and toughness, not a finesse scorer. So that's going to be his role. Give them some of those things you ask for in terms of physicality at that position.
Then we have a high major transfer, 6'3", Brennan Rigsby, averaged from Oregon. He averaged 6.1 points a game on 41, 35, and 69 shooting. And so he's probably going to be one of the backcourt reserves.
Yeah, with a chance to be a starter.
Sure.
I mean, I'm making an assumption that
it's Minnesota.
that Patterson and Odukale will be the starters. But, Rigsby, as you say, he has experience at the high major level and pretty decent experience. He was a good player for Oregon last year. But one way or the other, Rigsby's going to play minutes. And so, again, it's important that, if you're Ben Johnson, you're doing everything you can, not just to replace the guys you lost, but hopefully to lengthen your bench, get a deeper rotation. I think he would like to play more people than he's been able to. He just hasn't been in a position to be able to do that.
Right. Then we got Caleb Williams, 6'2", transfer from D3 McAllister College. That's in Minnesota, I think.
Yep.
Around Twin Cities. I think one of my friends in high school went to McAllister. So he averaged 20 points a game last season, shot 44%, 35% from three, third all-time leading scorer at McAllister in just the 3 years. So hard to say what'll happen, how that transfers up from D3 to D1.
It's funny to think about where that phenomenon has come from in the last 10 years. So if you think back to the John Beilein era at Michigan, and they had the moment where they had I'm drawing a blank on the kid's name. He's in the NBA, plays for Miami, and transferred in from Williams.
Yeah. I should remember his name. It'll come to us in about 20 minutes.
Drawing a blank on his name. He's a shooter, deep shooter. But in any event, that was something you just didn't see. Like guys transferring up from D3 to D1, and not just transferring up, but succeeding, was just never really. I mean, I strain to think of many examples before that. I know that they happened, but not frequently. Now we see it. I'm not saying it's every team, but much more regularity than we used to see. And so this is another example where you have a guy moving up from the D3 level to Minnesota, and they think he might be able to play. And that's a remarkable thing, but maybe less remarkable than it once was,
Yeah.
And so we'll see. I mean, obviously he was a shooter at the D3 level. And we'll see how well that translates. You're not talking about a guy with a ton of size, certainly. So things are going to have to break the right way. But the fact that they decided to take a chance on him is Duncan Robinson.
I was just going to say, I looked it up. I was going to say,
I
it's Duncan
sounded
Robinson.
distracted. It's because I was killing myself trying to remember his name.
I should have mentioned it, yeah.
He's the first example of this phenomenon that I can recall in the Big Ten, or at least the first in a long time. And we've had a few of them now. And so Caleb Williams would be another example. We'll see how he translates, but the reason he's here is shooting.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that.
Well, the next player is another Mitchell. This is Frank Mitchell, 6'8" forward, transferring from Canisius. He averaged 12.1 points a game and 11.6 rebounds a game, shooting 56 and 33, which is the exact multiple of 3, so that's a very low volume, and 43 from the line. So he's going to be a guy pushing Fox to start that power forward. If nothing else, he'll give some depth at that position.
Well, look, 11.6 rebounds per game is 11.6 rebounds per game, no matter what level of D1 you're playing at.
Yeah.
So I think at a minimum, Mitchell is a guy they're going to ask to make an impact on the boards. And yeah, I would think he'll be right there with Fox at the 4 spot. So an important addition from that perspective, giving them some presence. Not as big as Pharrell Payne was, but you have to like the production at Canisius. Again, we'll see how it translates.
Then there's Trey Edmonds, 6'9" transfer from Texas, San Antonio, averaging 7 points a game, 5.8 rebounds a game in 22 minutes. Shot 56% from the floor, 46 from the line. So not a great shooter, but someone maybe could just bang around inside.
Yeah, another big body I think will be in their rotation somewhere because they need some depth, behind Garcia, for example. I would expect Edmonds will be in the playing group. We'll see how large the playing time is within that.
Then Isaac Asuma, 6'2" freshman point guard. He's also a kid from Minnesota. He might be playing a little reserve role for the Gophers as well, but hard to imagine he's going to see a whole lot of time this season. But who knows?
Yeah, you just don't know. I mean, Asuma is not a high-level recruit, but that doesn't mean that he might not be capable of breaking through into their rotation as a freshman. They need the help. Look, if somebody else on that roster proved really capable of handling the point position, and that would enable Mike Mitchell to spend more time off the ball, I think Ben Johnson would gladly take it. Yeah. Gladly. That would be the preferred outcome. It doesn't seem very likely to me, but you never know.
And finally, Grayson Grove, another Minnesota recruit, 6'9", 230-pound post player who, like most post players coming in as freshmen, physically probably is not going to be ready to play right away at Big Ten level.
Yeah, and getting a guy like Edmonds to help, and Frank Mitchell as well, adding those two guys to what they already had in Garcia and Fox is important from that perspective. It means that they don't have to throw a freshman who probably isn't quite ready into the fire, so it gives Grove a year to develop, and maybe, we'll see if they think he's got potential to help at this level, but I don't think they'll have to, barring injury, I don't think they'll have to play him much this season.
Right. All right. So looking at the Minnesota team, I think this is a very obvious question. So who's a player that teams will have to keep in the gutter this season? I think without a doubt it's Dawson Garcia. And so he's their best player from almost every aspect at this point as far as looking forward. Maybe not outside shooting, but he's definitely a player you're going to have to focus on. And if you need your gutters worked on or need them cleaned out, repaired, replaced, maybe you just need some leaf guards put on, or you want that under roof put on under your deck, the Brothers Adjust Your Gutters should be your place to call. Anywhere on the west side or the east side of the state, they can take care of you, give you great pricing. 10% off if you mention Final Four when you get your estimate. You can find ways to contact them, either if you're on the west side or the east side of the state. If you go to our tffinots.com/support page, there you can find ways to get a hold of Kurt or Greg. They'll set you up, and they do fantastic work, whether it's a small job or big job, residential or commercial. They'll take care of you. So that kind of brings us to outlook for Minnesota. Obviously, not looking at a team with a whole lot of talent. They were sort of decimated by the transfer and by people just leaving early. And, I guess, what's your final, outlook for this team? Because in some respects, as you mentioned, you get a couple breaks, a couple teams have some injuries, and suddenly you're, 12th place instead of 18th. But
absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And picking them 18th should not be taken as any kind of lock. I could see Minnesota finishing better. I have a hard time seeing this as a tournament quality team. That right. I feel more comfortable saying, but they're kind of here just because somebody has to be last. You could poke similar holes in some other rosters around the league. That's for sure. As I said at the outset, I like Ben Johnson, and one thing I like that he's been able to do is establish some core principles. The most obvious one to me is that his teams have pretty regularly played hard, which you might think should be a given, but it's not.
Yeah.
And his teams have really competed over his time there. So assuming that happens with this group as well, you never know what that might be able to produce. It might be able to produce, 7 wins in the league instead of 4. I mean, it's possible. When you have a player of Garcia's level, that alone gives you a chance most nights in this league, because any given night, let's say Garcia is regularly, an 18-point-a-night guy, which is pretty much what he was last year. And that's who he is on a night-to-night basis. But that also means there are going to be a few nights where he's more of a 30-point guy.
Right.
And on those nights, they could patch the majority of Big Ten teams unaware and sneak out a win. And so that's why it makes a difference, as I kept saying earlier in our conversation. You haven't historically always had teams down at this level that had players like that. And when you have a player like that, it gives you a chance. It's not going to be something that is going to come up roses every night, but on occasion, it probably will. The key is going to be, obviously, how much do some of these newcomers add? Last year, pretty clear Minnesota did a great job in the portal. Hawkins and Mitchell were both transfer up guys. You didn't know how that would translate, and it went very, very well for them. Will it go well again this year? You've got Patterson, Odukale, and Rigby, 3 new guards at a minimum, and then there's Williams as well, so 4. How well do those guys translate? If they're all effective, hey, I might really be underestimating Minnesota. They might be the 11th best team in the league, or 12th instead of 18th. It's possible. But handicapping it, I'm going to assume that it doesn't all come up positively for Minnesota. And so I think that it's unlikely that they shoot as well. I think that not having a point guard at Hawkins level is going to hurt offensive production across the board. I just don't think they'll be as good. And then again, as you mentioned at the outset, their defense wasn't great last year anyway. So is it possible they could get better? Maybe. But if they're the same level or worse than they were last year, combined with a less effective offense, as I suspect they will have, you see why I'm picking them where I am.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, someone's got to start out at 18. And so that's where we'll begin. Just a final reminder to listeners, if you want to like what we're doing, you appreciate the analysis that you get nowhere else, and the focus on Michigan State basketball and a Michigan State basketball only podcast, head on over and consider supporting us either on Substack or Patreon, or maybe just a one-time gift for your PayPal or Venmo. You can find ways to do that and link the proper links at the Final Four is on the schedule.com/support. And so until next time, and the number 17 team, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go Green.